Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending or tuning into our 48th episode of the Peaceable Kingdom Hour, which is titled Anabaptism. My name is Matthew A. King, and I am your host. This live stream is made possible in collaboration with allcreatures.org, leading the way in faith based vegan animal rights since 1998, and with the Christian Animal Rights Association, a non denominational Bible based ministry. All opinions and teachings expressed in this series are the commentaries of me, Matthew A. King. But as far as the teaching agenda, we have a disclaimer coming up, as well as Anabaptist history, beliefs, distinct practices, worship, and church structure, followed by a discussion on Amish treatment of animals, and then finally a look at Anabaptist commentary on animals. And so before I start, of course, too, there's the disclaimer. And so what I first wanted to say, too, was that I critique and criticize a little bit of an Anabaptist denomination, the Amish, which are the Mennonites, throughout, with a particular focus in one part of the teaching on how they generally treat animals, and that's not meant to be conveyed as all Amish people are terrible to animals. It's just a general critique, and that, of course, if that's offensive, I don't mean to be. It's not saying that all Amish people are terrible to animals. It's just a generalization. So that's just something to keep in mind as the teaching goes on. But what exactly is Anabaptism? So, Anabaptism is a Christian theological tradition, sometimes known as the radical wing of the Protestant Reformation. Developed during the 16th century Protestant Reformation, Anabaptism contended that other Protestant movements such as Lutheranism or Calvinism were right in demanding reform of the Roman Catholic Church. However, these radicals complained that in some respects the Protestant reformers had not gone far enough with their demands. The Anabaptists encouraged their fellow Christians to embrace further reforms such as adult baptism, which is the term Anabaptist literally means rebaptizer. Their opponents gave them this name when they began administering adult baptism to one another, believing that their baptism as infants was not an authentic form of baptism. The Anabaptists contended that baptism should follow the commitment one makes to follow Jesus, and thus rejected infant baptism. While many 21st century Christian groups now practice adult baptism, sometimes called believer's baptism, practicing this form of baptism in the 16th century was dangerous, and it often brought persecution to the Anabaptists. And that's something that's interesting too, is because a lot of times we don't think about baptism, which is just basically sprinkling water over someone's head, as being something that's dangerous, and yet people have died for the belief that baptism has certain rules and regulations that should be I just only as an adult or both infant and adult. Um, but it often brought persecution to the Anabaptists, and that was something that they were persecuted for, and that's something that you're going to see throughout this teaching, is that the Anabaptists were known for being persecuted. That's something that runs throughout their history. Voluntary church membership is something that they value. In the 16th century, every citizen in a given geographical area was automatically a member of the church. The Anabaptists had a different conception of the church, believing that church membership should consist only of those who made a voluntary adult decision to follow Jesus. The church, said the Anabaptists, should be a voluntary, visible gathering of believers who committed themselves to encourage and discipline one another. A far cry from seeing the church as comprised of everyone who resided in a given geographical area. And that's basically what the Catholic Church did too, is that they would assign an area, and that was your church in your geographical area. And so you were automatically assigned that, but you couldn't go to a church that was in a different area. So if you lived in, we'll say, Pittsburgh, you couldn't go to the church in Johnstown because you were in that Pittsburgh area. And that was something that a lot of denominations took issue with, especially the Anabaptists. They also believed in separation of church and state. So that was a really big aspect of their early advocacy, and that was something that very much aligned with the new colonies in America. So it was something that was very that aligned with the new America that was being formed. The Anabaptists did not think it was appropriate to link the church and the government. In the 16th century, however, the link was taken for granted by most other Christians. For instance, if a person lived in a region where the rulers were Catholic, his or her only church option was a Catholic church. And if that same person lived in a region where the rulers were Protestant, his or her only church option was a Protestant church. And the Anabaptists, they argued that government officials should not have the authority to determine a citizen's church affiliation or a church's theology, and they therefore called for the separation of the church and the state. And that was something that I was actually just talking about this with my dad yesterday about how Jesus said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God. And Christianity's always had that sort of tension between what is the role of the government and what is the role of the church, and should they ever intersect or be combined. And there's a long debate about that. Pacifism in a society racked by violence and selfishness is another value that they have. Anabaptists called for placing the way of Jesus above self and group interest. The Anabaptists interpreted Jesus' command to love one's enemies, which is in Matthew 5:43 to 45, as a real command, and they embraced his teaching that because his kingdom was not of this world, his disciples would not fight their enemies with the weapons of this world. John 18:36. So the Anabaptists concluded that to truly follow Jesus, they needed to reject the sword as a way of responding to their enemies. Because of their new ideas, the Anabaptists often found themselves persecuted by other Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, which is ironic. They basically said, we're not going to fight you and we're going to be nonviolent, and they were persecuted for that. But indeed, thousands of Anabaptists suffered martyrdom during the 16th and 17th centuries, and they survived this persecution, however, and added to their numbers, and some eventually migrated to North America. And the most numerous Anabaptist immigrants were Mennonites, and that actually was taken from a name from an early Dutch Anabaptist leader named Menno Simons, and so that was his first name. So they were of the people of Menno, Mennonites. So Menno Simons was his name. The Amish and the Hutterites were two other Anabaptist groups that migrated to North America, which they still have numbers as well today. And I especially know that the Amish have something of an interesting place in Pennsylvania lore, because if you drive out towards Lancaster, PA, which I'm not really anywhere near, I'm in Western PA, but if you drive to Eastern PA, there's a lot of Amish and Anabaptist churches, and you can see that because they have the horse and carriage transportation. They don't use electricity, so that's something that's a very interesting dynamic of Pennsylvania living, and a little bit of Ohio as well. There are some Amish in Ohio, but there was also a pretty famous movie that was filmed in Lancaster called Witness. That was all about there was a police detective that Harrison Ford plays, and he goes undercover in an Amish settlement to try to figure out a murder. So that movie really put the Amish in the spotlight, and really made them somewhat of a fascination. And so in Pennsylvania, the Amish are pretty well known. Um, but with that, the Brethren in Christ Church, the founding denomination of Messiah College, has its roots in the Anabaptist tradition. And that's sort of going off that too. Messiah College is actually located in Pennsylvania, and they are very much of the Anabaptist tradition, specifically the Brethren in Christ Church. And that's a pretty famous college. I actually, the senator, my senator, one of my state senators, actually, his staffer went to Messiah College. So there's a lot of links there for me. And so this is somewhat of a teaching that comes close to home for me. But most of the church's 18th century founders were Mennonites, and while they were not completely satisfied with the Mennonite churches they left, they nonetheless retained the Anabaptist convictions outlined above. Thus, the Brethren in Christ Church is a Christian church in the Anabaptist tradition. So then there's the source on that. But Anabaptism, a brief history. Reformations. In 16th century Europe, it was in the throes of major cultural changes that were disrupting the political, economic, social, and religious arrangements that had persisted for several centuries, and that was in the midst of the Protestant Reformation. In particular, medieval feudalism was giving way to capitalism, and a new urban middle class was growing in influence and threatening traditional social power structures. Nationalism was becoming an unstoppable force as hundreds of principalities and several free cities vied for authority with the Holy Roman Empire. And these economic and political changes were causing serious hardship among the peasants, provoking a widespread but short-lived revolt in the mid-1520s. And so attempts to reform the massively wealthy, bureaucratic, and corrupt institutional church had been unsuccessful, but demands for reform were insistent. And so the Anabaptist movement emerged on the back of two very different attempts to bring transformation to church and society, which was the Protestant Reformation, which was calling for reform in the church, and peasants movement. The peasants movement was calling for reform in society. And so basically, the Protestant Reformation called for reform in the church, and the peasants movement was calling for reform in society. And these two things were happening sort of conglomerately or at the same time. And so some early Anabaptist leaders were involved in the reform movement that Luther started, especially several colleagues of Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich. And I've mentioned his name before, talking about the Protestant Reformation. But some Anabaptists got very involved with Martin Luther's early Protestant Reformation. They became frustrated with the slow progress there and withdrew their support in order to pursue a more radical vision. And so others were caught up in the peasants' movement, but gradually realized that there was no prospect of implementing the political and economic changes they had fought for and decided to pursue their vision of a just and harmonious community in other ways. And so Anabaptism emerged as a scattered community seeking alternative strategies for reform coalesced, offering fresh hope to those who had been disappointed by other attempts to reform church and society. And so Anabaptists in Switzerland, that was a big seedbed of where Anabaptism took off. But on the evening of January 21st, 1525, less than 8 years after the start of the Protestant Reformation, a small group of Christians were meeting secretly in a house in Zurich to talk and pray together. And they had been enthusiastic followers of Ulrich Zwingli, a name you'll hear quite often in the Protestant Reformation. He was a minister of the Grossmünster who was attempting to reform both the church and the city of Zurich. But they were now deeply troubled by his apparent reluctance to follow through on what he had been preaching and to implement what they regarded as clear biblical teaching on a number of issues, including the baptism of believers rather than infants. And the meeting on January 21st was considered a very radical step. The Bible, they believed, taught that believers should be baptized. But they had all been baptized as infants, but now they regarded this as unbiblical and ineffectual. So they wanted to be baptized as believers, as men and women who were freely choosing to become followers of Jesus and had counted the cost of discipleship. This would be very costly indeed. They might discount their baptism as infants, but in the eyes of the authorities, what they were considering was rebaptism, an offense punishable by death, which to us is probably crazy to think that you can be punished with death by simply being baptized again, because it's such a normal part of our culture. And in fact, most churches actually have infant baptisms when they're children, and then the believer will grow up and actually have their own baptism, which is considered an authentic sort of step in the faith. But nevertheless, after a time of heart-searching and fervent prayer, George Blaurock stood up and besought Conrad Grebel, for God's sake, to baptize him with the true Christian baptism upon his faith and knowledge. And when he knelt down with such a request and desire, Conrad baptized him. And in these famous words, the Chronicle of the Hutterian Brethren reports the first recorded instance of believers' baptism in the Reformation era and the start of what had become known as the Anabaptist movement. So Anabaptist is known as rebaptizing, is basically what it means. But George Blaurock and Conrad Grebel were two early leaders of the Swiss Brethren, as the Anabaptists who originated in Zurich are known, because it basically came from Switzerland, in Zurich specifically. But another significant figure was Felix Manz. He was a biblical scholar, the first Anabaptist to be executed by the city authorities, drowned in the Lamont River. And so there goes that persecution again. This execution was intended to demonstrate that the authorities would not tolerate Anabaptism. Persecution followed the Anabaptists wherever they went, but the movement was already spreading beyond the city and taking root in the countryside, partly because the Zurich group were determined to evangelize elsewhere, and partly because Anabaptists deported from the city found themselves in the neighboring towns and villages. And within months, the movement had spread east, west, and north, and then across the border into Catholic territory to Waldshut. And then this town was moving in the direction of reform under the leadership of Balthasar Hubmaier, who some people might have heard his name before. It's somewhat well known. He would become the foremost Anabaptist theologian. There was popular support also in Halle. Here and elsewhere, the Anabaptist movement intersected with the peasants' movement, recognizing shared concerns and offering mutual support. So you had these two sort of movements that were coalescing together and working together. But then by the end of 1525, which was exactly 500 years ago, the peasants' movement had been destroyed, and the authorities were determined to snuff out any further threats, including Anabaptism. Most Anabaptists realized that if they were to survive, their only course was to pursue their vision within separatist underground communities. And so Anabaptism was sort of an underground movement for a long time because of the persecution involved. And in February 1527, representatives of the scattered Anabaptist communities gathered in the village of Schleitheim. Out of the concern emerged the Schleitheim Confession, 7 articles setting out the distinctive convictions of the Swiss Brethren. So that was sort of their doctrine, was the Schleitheim Confession. Not surprisingly, these articles are separatist and uncompromising in tone. They are also thoroughly pacifist. And so Anabaptists, they sort of remind me of like Anonymous for the Voiceless, in which they knew from the outset that they were going to be radical and they wanted to be taken seriously, and they were sort of uncompromising, but also nonviolent. And so that's what it sort of reminded me of. Um, and Tanya actually responded. She said the Amish also got very popular from a TV show back in the day called Amish Mafia. Oh, I didn't know that. Thank you. I didn't know any. I've never heard that before. That's really cool. I know you're in Ohio. Sorry, I'm sure you don't mind me saying, but I know that there is a certain amount of Amish populations in Ohio. I know Berlin, Ohio. That's a pretty Amish town. My parents actually visit that quite often during the course of. They maybe go out there 3 or 4 times a year. It's fairly close to Pittsburgh. But yeah, thank you for that, Tanya. This confession would be the rallying point for most Swiss Anabaptists. If it was dangerous being an Anabaptist, it was even more perilous being an Anabaptist leader. The authorities targeted the leaders, and few survived for long. There were no safe places. Catholic and Protestant authorities alike imprisoned, fined, tortured, and executed Anabaptists. Catholics usually burned them. Protestants beheaded or drowned them. Some Swiss Anabaptists survived by going underground, especially in remote rural and mountainous regions, but most eventually emigrated in search of refuge. Many fled east into Moravia, where they joined Anabaptists fleeing from other parts of Europe. And so some traveled north or west into Germany and the Netherlands, evangelizing as they went, but these territories offered no more than temporary respite. Anabaptists in South Germany and Austria. Anabaptist communities began to emerge in South Germany and Austria very soon after the first baptisms in Zurich and before the movement was widespread in Swiss towns and villages. So that's the main point, too, that I recognize the theme within the Anabaptist tradition was this one of persecution. Since the very beginning, they were persecuted, and that sort of continues on to this day because of they were breaking away from the Catholic Church, but also they also weren't making friends with the Protestant Reformation, which made them very culpable to being persecuted. And I thought it was interesting, too, that the Catholics had a way of burning them and the Protestants had a way of beheading them. And so no matter where they went, their violence was struck upon them. And the irony being that they were completely nonviolent. And so they weren't even going to fight back. But I guess that's human nature for you, right? But three founding figures within Anabaptism were Hans Denk. He was a school teacher with an emphasis on love and unity. Hans Hut, apparently a common name, was Hans, a passionate evangelist. He was a bookseller by profession. He traveled widely, baptizing thousands and planting Anabaptist churches in major cities, towns, and villages across South Germany and Austria. So that's kind of cool. He was a bookseller, and then where he would go and sell his books, he would plant churches. And my grandfather actually grew up in Germany, and he lived with his uncle Hans. And so Hans was a fairly common name in Germany for a long time, probably still is. Melchior Rink, he was a classical scholar who traveled around Hesse and Saxony, preaching and baptizing until he was arrested and imprisoned. Again, there's that. South German and Austrian Anabaptists were different from Swiss Anabaptism. They displayed a passionate concern for social justice, mystical spirituality, and a deep conviction that the end of history was near. And so the Swiss were sort of more doctrinal focused with the Schleitheim Confession, whereas the German and Austrian Anabaptists were more of the social justice, mystical, spiritual, and sort of this idea of apocalyptic Christianity where the end was near. And so they were sort of more social justice focused. But the Austrians and the German Anabaptists, they lack the cohesion of the Swiss brethren. And that often happens too when there's a lack of doctrine. But like the Swiss, they suffered the loss of key leaders very early. But unlike the Swiss, they did not coalesce around a confession of any kind. And so 4 groups evolved out of that, one was apocalyptic, which was probably the German and the Austrian. Another embraced mystical spirituality, again, more Austrian-German. A third combined these emphases, and so it was sort of a mixture of the two. And then a fourth turned in a more separatist direction. The other main figure in this branch of the Anabaptist movement was Pilgrim Marpeck. He was a former mayor and a mining magistrate of Rottenburg. Marpeck was disappointed by the lack of discipleship in most churches and became an Anabaptist. Moving to Strasbourg, where he worked as an engineer, Marpeck assumed leadership of an Anabaptist community in the city until exiled in 1532. And after a period on the move, he settled again in Augsburg and led an Anabaptist community there until his death in 1556. So Marpeck's social position meant that he needed to wrestle seriously with the question of how far to engage with the power structures of his day without compromising his Anabaptist principles. Anabaptists in North Germany and the Netherlands, that was another focus. The origins of Anabaptism in North Germany and the Netherlands can be traced to a single charismatic and enigmatic leader, Melchior Hoffman. He was a furrier, ironically, despite the nonviolence, from this one's hard to pronounce. I had to sort of look this up, but it's Swabish Hall. His journey illustrates how those yearning for reformation might gradually become more and more radical in their views and activities. Hoffman initially identified with the Lutheran movement, and by 1523 he was working as a lay preacher in Livonia until he was expelled. And so after a meeting with Martin Luther in Wittenberg in 1525, exactly 100 years ago, he moved to Dorpat, where his anti-clericalism and message of social justice made him popular with the poor, but caused him to fall out with his Lutheran colleagues. And so that was kind of interesting, is that he had two different people that were, or two different groups that were watching him, and one ended up falling out because probably of their wealth and status, but then he made him very popular with the poor and those focused on social justice. He went to Stockholm in Sweden as a Lutheran missionary, and again stirred up controversy before moving to Schleswig-Holstein in 1527. Here he turned decisively away from Luther and branded his former colleagues false prophets. And in 1529, his property was confiscated. He was expelled once more. Moving to Strasbourg, he interacted with reformers, spiritualists, and several varieties of Anabaptists, blending different elements into his own theology. He was baptized there, but formed his own group rather than joining an existing congregation. But his revolutionary and anti-clerical views alarmed the authorities, and he fled to escape arrest. So there again is the persecution that you see. During the next 3 years, he traveled widely, evangelizing and baptizing hundreds of people, especially in the Netherlands. Hoffman was imprisoned in 1533, apparently allowing himself to be arrested in the belief that this was necessary for the New Jerusalem to be established in Strasbourg. So he believed that if he got arrested, that would help bring, Jesus would bring the new earth to earth, and I'm sure he was disappointed by that to find out that that wasn't true. But he spent the remainder of his life in prison, dying perhaps 10 years later, still awaiting the events that he had prophesied. So his prophecies did not come true. But his movement grew and spread across the Netherlands and in part of North Germany, but Hoffman's imprisonment left it without adequate leadership. And so that became a problem with Anabaptism as well, is because of the amount of persecution that they suffered, they often had situations where they were without leadership. And so that becomes a blow to the movement. In the next 2 years, as a disaster would occur, which authorities across Europe would seize on. In the next 2 years, a disaster would occur, which authorities across Europe would seize on as demonstrating that Anabaptists were indeed dangerous subversives. And so Jan Mathis, he was a Haarlem baker. And you might notice Haarlem there is spelled with two A's. And there's also, we have a Harlem in the United States, which is in New York City. It's a borough of New York City. But Haarlem actually has two A's, and it actually had two A's when it was in New York City. There's actually a sign up there where the original Haarlem sign stood. It was later shortened to have only one A, but that's because the Netherlands actually owned New York City or colonized it. It was known as New Amsterdam back in the 1600s. And so a lot of the territories have these Dutch names. And then there was a battle for New York City, and the British eventually took ownership or colonialization of New York City over from the Dutch. And so then they anglicized Haarlem. And so they dropped that extra A. So it's Jan Mathis was a Haarlem baker, not to be confused with New York City Haarlem, but Haarlem in the Netherlands. He was a baker that assumed leadership of the movement and sent out 12 apostles to evangelize and baptize. And among the places they visited was the German town of Munster. That's where Munster cheese comes from. Some people call it Munster cheese, where their reception convinced Mathis that Hoffman had been right, that the New Jerusalem was imminent, but wrong about its location. And so Munster, not Strasbourg, was the chosen site. So again, a lot of disappointment here because they found out that that was, after all, not the site. But a group of Anabaptists won the support of the local electorate and issued a call to Anabaptists everywhere to make their way to Munster and became citizens of the New Jerusalem. Thousands attempted to reach the city, although most were turned back by the authorities. And so Munster was quickly surrounded by troops under the command of the local bishop. 2 failed assaults were followed by blockade to starve the town into submission. Mathis led a desperate breakout, believing that God would deliver him, but was killed. And so there again, we have these sort of people that think that they're commanded by God, and then they end up being sort of disappointed. But he was succeeded by Jan von Leyden. He was a young tailor who instituted sweeping and violent reforms, using Old Testament legislation as his mandate. He introduced polygamy, mandated capital punishment for minor offenses, and awaited the descent of the New Jerusalem. And so his Van Leyden had these ideas of, maybe in order to bring the new earth down to Munster to sort of become what's known as a theonomist, where you take the Old Testament laws and regulations and you apply them to a city. And that's what a lot of I'm a postmillennialist, but I'm not necessarily a theonomist. I'm maybe a little bit sympathetic to it, but it's this idea that theonomy. I'll do an entire teaching on it one day, but it's basically the idea that in order to improve the world, the government needs to be taken hold of and then um, mandate Old Testament law in place of human law, or like where laws are right now. And so that's been done before in history. Here it didn't work out so well. It didn't actually end up leading to the New Jerusalem being established. But theonomy, that was basically a very early version of theonomy, which I don't want to speak for him, but I believe my father was a theonomist, and then also Douglas Wilson is a pretty well-known theonomist that I do like some of his writings. But after a prolonged siege, Munster was finally captured and its inhabitants were massacred. Munster was the greatest catastrophe of early Anabaptist history, resulting in increasing persecution across Europe, even in previously tolerant areas. And so that was a disaster, was Munster. Munster was pretty much that was a big problem for the Anabaptists, because where they had previously been non-violent, they suddenly became violent. And then also they basically had a city on lockdown and the authorities had to become involved, and it ended up being many people were killed, and Anabaptists only increased their persecution without any really success within Munster. Anabaptism in North Germany and the Netherlands survived the fall of Munster, but the movement lost coherence. And so most renounced violence, and the most significant leader during the next few years was David Joris, who urged pacifism and emphasized interior spirituality to the extent that external marks of Anabaptism were regarded as unimportant. So communities of his followers persisted for several decades, but Joris failed in his attempts to reunite the movement under his leadership, and he eventually left the area. And so the future of Anabaptism in the Netherlands rested with those who had rejected Munster all along and maintained a pacifist position. And that's generally true too, is usually, anytime people resort to violence, they're usually not taken seriously. Like they've done studies on that actually show that, for instance, for animal activists, the more nonviolent you are, even though it will take longer to achieve the results, the more success you'll have. And so that's generally the outlook too, is that once you resort to violence, that becomes an easy way for people to dismiss you. Not that violence is ever not justified. I understand the impetus and the impulse, but a lot of times it doesn't actually lead to good conclusions. And it's like what Ecclesiastes says: there's a time for peace, a time for violence. There might be a time where violence might be necessary, especially in the aspect of self-defense, but a lot of times it doesn't actually lead to anything or lead to anything good. And so that's really what it is too, is that Anabaptism became successful, and the ones that persisted were the ones that maintained that sort of pacifist position, and that's something I think that we can learn from. But the key leaders were Ob and Dirk Phillips, and an ex-Catholic priest named as Menno Simons, who I mentioned before. That's where they get the name Mennonite from whom the Mennonites take their name. Menno joined the movement in 1536, and the following year he was ordained as an elder. He spent the rest of his life traveling among scattered Anabaptist communities, teaching and pastoring them, and gradually welding them into a coherent movement. And what's interesting is he was actually an ex-Catholic priest, so that was kind of cool. He had a lot of experience in a different denomination. His extensive writings and patient ministry enabled Dutch Anabaptism to survive and thrive. Despite being a wanted man, he repeatedly escaped capture and eventually died peacefully. An evolving movement, and so the Swiss, South German, Austrian, and North German / Dutch branches of Anabaptism, as we have seen, were not isolated from each other, and there were significant theological and cultural differences between these communities. But letters, visits, and conversations enabled the exchange of ideas and provoked passionate debates. Whatever diversity there may have been among early Anabaptists, the authorities were in no doubt that they were facing a single movement that represented a serious threat to both church and state. So despite the persecution, it was a movement that was taken very seriously. The number of people actively involved in this movement is difficult to ascertain, but it certainly ran into tens of thousands within the first generation, and many more people were attracted to Anabaptism, but were not baptized as members, aware of what this step might cost them. And so they were aware that, they didn't really want to become a formal member of the church because it might involve their death. Thousands of Anabaptists were martyred in the 16th century, and then the flight of Anabaptists in various directions in search of refuge from persecution mixed up the different groups even further. And so in the 1550s, another round of discussions took place in Strasbourg. Although these discussions did not bring about immediate uniformity, a single movement began to emerge. And the gradual disappearance of the more mystical, apocalyptic, and revolutionary groups meant that these elements were marginalized within the emerging tradition. And so the story of Anabaptism over the next 4 centuries is of sporadic persecution, flight, and relocation. And so from North Germany and Holland, they fled east into Poland, Moravia, Russia, and the Ukraine, and then across the seas to Canada and the USA. From Switzerland and Austria, South Germany, they fled west to the new American colonies. And so the United States was very much a hotbed for not only the Anabaptists, but many other denominations. The Anabaptists left in Western Europe survived either by retreating into quietness and avoiding further confrontation, or in the more tolerant Netherlands by becoming respectable and mildly nonconformist. Their modern descendants include the Mennonites, who are now spread worldwide and are especially active in areas of conflict resolution, mission, and social ministry. The Church of the Brethren, who we talked about, which founded Messiah College. The Brethren in Christ, the Amish, and the communal Hutterites. And so until about 70 years ago, almost all church historians regarded the Anabaptists as heretical, marginal, or revolutionary, which is kind of interesting. Assessments of them were based not on their own writings, but on the hostile accounts produced by their opponents. And so they've got sort of labeled as these cranks that were heretical and revolutionary, but that wasn't really necessarily true. It was written by the Catholics and the Protestants who opposed them. But in recent years, scholars, spurred on by the advocacy of Harold Bender's landmark speech in 1944, the Anabaptist Vision, have rediscovered the Anabaptists. Today, the movement has become a global community with its greatest strength in places like Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And so Anabaptist distinctives, I'm going to go over that. Let me just look here. And Tanya also mentioned that TV show actually took place in Pennsylvania. That's kind of what I figured. That's definitely the most common place for the Amish. Usually Lancaster, PA, or as a lot of traditionalists will say, Lancaster, PA. That's sort of the prime location where you're going to see a lot of Amish people. That's pretty typical. And that's where Witness took place also from Harrison Ford. Which is a really good movie, by the way. I highly recommend. It's got some sort of graphic violence and some sexual scenes. So I wouldn't, recommend it to everyone, but a mature audience could definitely, learn a lot from it. But Anabaptist distinctives, what makes them distinct? The Anabaptists need to be understood in the context of the Protestant Reformation, which was sweeping across Europe in the first half of the 16th century. Although other factors such as social discontent played a part in its emergence, Anabaptism grew out of the Reformation and owed much to it, as its leaders freely acknowledged. On many issues, Anabaptists agreed with the Reformers. They too were committed to the final authority of Scripture above tradition, justification by faith rather than by works, and the priesthood of all believers. So very much opposed the Catholicism aspect, just like the Reformers. But the Anabaptists were concerned that the Reformers either did not go far enough with these commitments, or that they were emphasizing them at the expense of other things that were just as important. Several things differentiated Anabaptists from the main Protestant reformers. The Bible. So Anabaptists agreed with the reformers about the authority of the Bible, but disagreed strongly about how it should be interpreted and applied. They gave priority to the New Testament and particularly to the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. Anabaptists started from Jesus and interpreted everything else in the light of him, which is a pretty solid starting point. Unlike the Reformers, whom Anabaptists suspected of starting from doctrinal passages and trying to fit Jesus into these. So they sort of started with Jesus. Everybody else was starting from the outside of Jesus and working in. They were starting with Jesus and working out. They refused to see the Bible as a flat book. They regarded it as an unfolding of God's purposes, with the New Testament setting the standard for Christian behavior and the shape of the church. And then as far as salvation, the Reformers emphasized justification by faith and the forgiveness of past sins. Anabaptists emphasized new birth and the power to live a new life. The Reformers feared that Anabaptists were reverting to salvation by works because of their stress on repentance and the importance of discipleship. And so the Reformers had sort of an issue with the Anabaptists because they resembled Catholics a little bit with their faith by works. The Anabaptists feared that the reformers were preaching cheap grace and accused them of failing to address moral issues and tolerating unchristian behavior in their churches. And so the Anabaptists, in turn, they had an issue with the Protestant Reformation because they felt like it was basically saying, do whatever you want, you're forgiven your sins, and there's no responsibility for you after that. And so that's sort of that cheap grace aspect. And then also this sort of tolerance of not calling people out for their unchristian behavior. And so, you're filling the church with people that aren't taking Christianity seriously, or it's very light demands, in my opinion. The Anabaptists gave a much larger role in practice of the work of the Holy Spirit in the believer, and they emphasized that Jesus was to be followed as well as trusted, obeyed as well as relied upon. Also, the Anabaptists were committed to forming churches of committed disciples rather than accepting the pariah system where everyone was regarded automatically as church members. They insisted on drawing a very clear line between believers and unbelievers, so that church membership was voluntary and meaningful. They acknowledged the role of the state and government, but they rejected state control of their churches. So that was something when they immigrated to America, that was something that was very much appreciated by them and very much fostered by the government, was this idea of separation of church and state. Something that in the United States is very important, but is increasingly becoming more blurred. Don't mean to get political, of course, but they firmly rejected infant baptism as unbiblical, forcibly imposed on children, and a hindrance to the development of genuine believers' churches. So very much against infant baptism, which actually is very similar to the Baptists. And ironically, the Baptists and the Anabaptists aren't really related at all. They didn't come, well, they're both part of the Protestant Reformation, but they went in different, they came from different traditions actually, but arrived at the same conclusion, which is kind of interesting. I actually thought in my first inclination was that the Baptists, the Anabaptists came from the Baptists, but that actually wasn't true. The Baptists, I believe, were associated with the Anglican Church, if I recall from my teaching. But the Anabaptists came from Switzerland, and so reached the same conclusion, but from different starting points. Two other features of state churches they criticized were clericalism and the absence of church discipline. The gatherings of many of the congregations were based on the principles set out in 1 Corinthians 14, which was a favorite chapter of theirs, that every member has a contribution to make. Their meetings were sometimes charismatic and quite unstructured, but with an emphasis on Bible study. Women were encouraged to play a significant part in at least some of their churches. So that was kind of nice to hear. I know a lot of women watching this will appreciate that they very much encourage women to be part of the church and not to silence them or act like they don't exist or just take care of the children. They were an active part of their churches. As far as evangelism, the reformers did not generally practice evangelism. Where they had secular support, the reformers relied on state sanctions to coerce attendance. They assumed within Protestant territories that church and society were not distinct, and so their policy was to pastor people through the parish system rather than to evangelize them as if they were unbelievers. Anabaptists rejected this interpretation of church and society and refused to use coercion. And so that's a big part of that, again, is that separation of church and state is something that they very much valued. Instead, they embarked on a spontaneous and explosive missionary enterprise to evangelize Europe. They traveled widely, preached in homes and fields, baptized converts, and planted churches. As far as lifestyle, the Anabaptists were acknowledged even by their critics to live exemplary lives. And this is kind of funny. Franz Agricola, he was a contemporary Roman Catholic. He expressed confusion about how these heretics behaved. As concerns their outward public life, they are irreproachable. No lying, deception, swearing, strife, harsh language, no intemperate eating and drinking, no outward personal display is found among them, but humility, patience, uprightness, neatness, hostility, temperance, straightforwardness in such measure that one would suppose they had the Holy Spirit of God. This witness by lifestyle attracted many converts, but exasperated the authorities. Non-Anabaptists who lived upright lives were sometimes arrested on suspicion. And so that's kind of funny, is that the Anabaptists, despite all of their revolutionary ideas and heretical aspects, no one ever really criticized their behavior, which is really funny because you would think as a heretic or a revolutionary, there would be these sort of people that would be like, oh, there are these troublemakers in their daily life, but they were actually very upright and good standing people and just focused on justice. And what's funny about that is people who weren't even Anabaptists, they were arrested on suspicion because they were living upright lives. And so they assumed that they were Anabaptists. And so Anabaptism was so closely associated with upright living. But the reformers were embarrassed by the obvious differences between the moral standards of the Anabaptists and members of their own churches. And so, nonconformity, Anabaptists aimed to be a deviant group within society, challenging contemporary norms and living under the authority of the Bible. In anticipation of the kingdom of God, they questioned the validity of private property, violence, and the swearing of oaths, and taught the importance of sharing resources. So, almost sort of like I hate to use the word, but almost like a communistic or socialistic vision of what they had in mind was sort of no private property, um, no violence, and then also sharing resources rather than private ownership. So they had this sort of vision of a utopia. Some groups practice community of goods. And so most retained personal ownership, but all were clear that their possessions were not their own and should be readily available to help those in need. Each time they shared in communion, they confirmed this commitment to each other. They practiced mutual aid and challenged wealth, greed, and injustice, which, who could argue that that's a bad thing? It's a very good thing. And I actually had an experience with that, actually. I used to work at a hospital on a neurosurgery wing as a nurse. Um, Still am a nurse by profession, but I had this Amish patient that had a back surgery, and uh, I guess the surgery was probably thousands of dollars, but it wasn't they weren't my patient exactly. They came up to when they found out the nurse that was in charge. This one little Amish lady came up and said, "Oh, here's the money to the hospital for his surgery and taking care of him. This is from the Amish community where we come from." And the nurse guessed that it was probably $20,000 or $30,000 that she was giving, but that was from the entire community that was given because this man needed back surgery. And so that's very much something about how the Amish function is that they very much help with one another and they help in each other's needs. And so that was sort of maintaining that Anabaptist vision. But of course, she directed him to the hospital administrator to deal with that. But I thought that was a really interesting aspect of Amish life is that instead of having private insurance, well, that's basically how insurance functions without profit. Is that the community has a pot where the money goes, and then if someone has medical needs, then they pay for it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And nonviolence, many Anabaptists refused to carry weapons, to go to war, or to defend themselves by force. They urged love for enemies and respect for human life. Anabaptists accepted that the state would use force to govern, but they regarded this as inappropriate for Christians. Thus, many taught that there was no role for Christians within government. Anabaptists aimed to build an alternative society to change society from the bottom up. Truth-telling. Oaths were important in the 16th century to ensure truth-telling in the courts and to coerce loyalty from citizens to the state. Anabaptists frequently refused to take such oaths on the basis of Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5, and on the grounds that and on the grounds that they should always be truthful, not just when under oath. Nor were they prepared to swear loyalty to any secular authority. So I thought that was really cool too, and I agree with the idea is that when you think about it, oaths shouldn't really be necessary. It's like I swear to tell the truth. It's like you should just always want to tell the truth. That's something that Christians should always want to do. No, unless of course it's there's exceptions, of course, like if you're hiding somebody in your basement that's a prisoner and the state wants to come and take him, like what you saw like in Nazi Germany, like where there was Christians that were hiding Jews in their basements or their attics from the Nazis, and people lying and saying, "Oh no, I don't have anybody here." That's an act of justice. And so there are times when maybe truth telling isn't the best solution, especially when it's to protect life. But those are few and far between exceptions. But also suffering, that's a big part of the Anabaptist experience. Anabaptists were not surprised by the outbreak of persecution. They realized that they would be seen as revolutionaries in spite of their commitment to nonviolence. As heretics, despite their commitment to the Bible, and as upsetters of the status quo. And I like that a lot about them too, is that they regarded themselves as upsetters of the status quo. And that's exactly what animal activists are. They regarded suffering for the sake of obedience to Christ as both unavoidable and biblical. Suffering was a mark of the true church, as Jesus had made clear in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, if they hate you, know that they hated me first. And that's the idea, is a lot of times in this world, when you're doing the right thing, the right people will hate you. If the reformers, and I know this from experience too, as an activist, there's many a business that dislikes me and the people that I work with. But if the reformers resorted to persecuting them, this was a clear sign that the reformers were not building a biblical church. The Anabaptist movement was drowned in blood in many parts of Europe, but their courageous martyrdoms attracted many people to their teachings. So much so that the authorities sometimes resorted to tongue screws to silence Anabaptists en route to their execution. And I actually had to look up what that meant, what a tongue screw was, but it was an ancient way of, I'm sure it probably still exists somewhere, but it's an ancient way of silencing people, and they would actually screw your tongue, like basically to the roof of your mouth, and so that way you couldn't speak. But it was an actual metal screw. And so weakness and challenges. There were significant weaknesses in the Anabaptist tradition, more apparent in some groups than others. Some groups tended toward legalism in their efforts to obey Christ's teaching. Some risked devaluing the Old Testament because of their determination to be Christ-centered. Some split into competing groups in the endless search for a truly pure church. Some pushed separation from society rather too far and had little vision for changing society for the better. So that's something that they had to sort of grapple with too, is that, when you value Christ, then you sort of devalue some of the regulatory aspects of the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And then, by focusing too much on separation from society, you aren't really engaging with society either. And I think that's sort of what's become of the Amish, is because, there was that joke during COVID, the lockdowns were happening and people were like, did anybody tell the Amish? And it's kind of funny because it's this idea that the Amish have separated themselves so much from regular society that they're not even really considered a sort of a tool for societal change. Like, they're not really spreading the gospel to other people because they're so focused on separating themselves, even just through electricity. Some of their convictions were not carefully worked out, as their leaders were often martyred before they had time to do this adequately. That's sort of what happened to Lutheranism too. Like, Martin Luther was persecuted so much that he wasn't able to work out some of the finer points of what he, some of the finer points of what he meant, and some of those nuances and distinctions. And that's sort of inevitable when your leader is persecuted. But the Anabaptist tradition still provokes, inspires, and challenges Christians to take Jesus seriously and refuse to dilute his teachings or shy away from his hard sayings. We need to rediscover the uncomfortable and provocative Jesus of the Gospels rather than taking refuge in the doctrinal sections of the epistles. And so that's sort of that aspect of prioritizing Jesus over Paul, which is probably something a lot of activists would really like. Truly Christ-centered Christianity remains elusive in many churches today. Build churches which are not really nonconformist and truly free, which encourage discipleship, mutual caring, and economic radicalism, which embody different values from the society around, which welcomes the poor and powerless, and which practice multi-voiced leadership and decision-making. Look carefully at issues of power, violence, and warfare, and how the churches should respond to these issues. Traditional teaching on these topics has been infected and distorted by the alliance of church and state that the Anabaptists rejected. So that was something that the Anabaptists have noticed too, is that a lot of times when the church and the state become allied, the message becomes distorted and too focused on power. And it's like George Carlin had a famous quote where he said that I'm all for the separation of church and state because both of those institutions are corrupt and should be separated. Or, I'm actually not doing the quote justice, but something like, let me look it up real quick. George Carlin, he's obviously one of my favorite comedians. Operation of church and state. George Carlin said, I'm completely in favor of the separation of church and state. My idea is that these two institutions screw us up enough on their own, so both of them together is a certain death. So he had a good point there, and the Anabaptists would agree with him. It is time to look again at the biblical teaching on peace and peacemaking and the implications of this teaching for ways in which the church contributes to the search for justice. Identify and work for the removal of the many unhelpful vestiges of Christendom that remained in church and society. And I think that's a noble effort. An Anabaptist perspective helps us identify and challenge the attitudes in our churches that are still governed by the ideal of a Christian society rather than the idea of a free church in a plural society. And then also develop a coherent approach to the issues of persecution and suffering. In contemporary Western society, privatized forms of faith are tolerated and persecution seems remote, whereas in many other places, Christians are under extreme pressure. Anabaptism offers theological and pastoral insights, earthed in experience, on ways churches and Christians can respond to opposition. And so that was the source on that. Really good source on Anabaptism, if you want a chance to look at it. And so then comments. Tanya said, yes, it was Lancaster. Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, I thought that's probably where the show took place. Pretty interesting. Yeah, and it's got a lot of that city's got a lot of notorious Amish related like businesses too. Like if you really want an experience for Amish living, Lancaster is definitely the place to see. And then winding down here, I'm going to focus on this. And so I want to talk about this within the Anabaptist tradition because the Amish are pretty much the most well known. But the Amish actually have a very, very bad record of animals. And I'm going to talk about that. But the Amish are a specific group that originated from the Anabaptist movement, making them a type of Anabaptist. The Amish, unfortunately, have a reputation for not being kind to animals. And this is something that I actually have seen firsthand. Google AI states numerous accounts from animal rescue organizations, former community members, and journalists indicate that animal abuse and neglect are disturbingly common within many Amish communities. The issue is particularly associated with puppy mills and the overworking and neglect of horses. Amish communities have become a significant source of puppies for the commercial pet trade in the United States. Reports from rescue groups detail a pattern of severe neglect and cruelty in many Amish-run mills. Inhumane conditions, breeding dogs and puppies are often kept in crowded, unsanitary, and cramped wire cages stacked in barns, where they receive no social interaction. And then lack of care, animals receive little or no veterinary attention, even for serious illnesses or injuries. Overbreeding, breeding dogs are forced into a relentless cycle of pregnancy until their bodies fail, after which they are often killed. And then also cruel disposal. When puppies fail to sell, some Amish breeders have reportedly killed them by methods such as drowning them in manure. And then also for the Amish, horses are essential for farming and transportation. However, their treatment is often utilitarian and reports of neglect are frequent. And then also overworking. Workhorses are sometimes pushed to the point of exhaustion and collapse, especially in hot weather. Physical abuse, instances of Amish men brutally beating horses have been documented and resulted in animal cruelty charges. And then also neglect and poor hoof care. Rescue organizations have saved horses from Amish farms with overgrown and deformed hooves and severe health problems from neglect. And then there's also horse slaughter. When an elderly or lame horse can no longer work, many Amish farmers sell them at auction where they are often purchased for slaughter. Some research suggests that a key factor driving this treatment is a selective interpretation of the Bible, which teaches that God gave humans dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Genesis 1:28. And so it's a utilitarian view. They basically view animals as tools or objects to be used. Some members of the community interpret this as animals existing solely for human use, leading to the perception of animals as property or tools. But not all Anabaptist views towards animals are bad. And I'm going to emphasize this. But I actually have some personal experience with that. My wife and I, the most recently, we went to Berlin, Ohio, and we saw a horse carriage. Now, granted, I don't know what the right answer for it is. Horse carriages, are common in a lot of cities like New York City. They've been trying for many years to ban them. I don't think that there's any excuse for banning horse carriages within cities where there's cars, where everybody has transportation readily available that don't involve the horses. That needs to be banned. I don't know what the right answer is for communities that don't use electricity. What are they supposed to do? We saw a lot of Amish people riding bikes, which is maybe a great alternative. But they can't do electric motors. Cars have electricity, so they can't drive that. So I don't really know what the answer is for that. But we saw a horse that was actually suffering. He was in the hot heat and he was drooling as he was carrying this, or he was pulling this carriage in Berlin, Ohio. He was obviously in distress. That's a very obvious sign of distress. And then also the heat had to have been really getting to him. And it was very obvious. And he was pulling this family that was not lightweight. We'll just put that. And he was obviously overworked, overstressed. And it's a big problem within the Amish community. And they sort of have earned that reputation, unfortunately. Not all, of course. And then also my best friend, Jared, his dog, her name is Dakota. She actually came from an Amish puppy mill, and they went to Lancaster to get a dog. And this is before they knew about rescue and stuff like that. But they were told, they're like, yeah, if you don't buy her from us, she's gonna be killed in a week. And so then Jared went home and thought about it. And then the next day they got her. But yeah, they told him straight up. They're like, yeah, she's been here too long, so we're going to execute her, as soon as we find out that she doesn't have a buyer in a week or no one wants to get her. So the Amish do have a reputation for being very cruel to animals, and I think that's something that needs to be mediated. Perhaps, and my wife and I have talked about maybe reaching out to Amish communities to try to foster that, because they're obviously focused on nonviolence, and so all they really need to do is just extend that to animals. Shouldn't be too far of a leap. But I wanted to read this article because this sort of this shows that not all Anabaptists are cruel to animals. But I found this article. It says the gospel of peace to all creation, and it was featured in the Mennonite in February 1st, 2012. Broadening the Anabaptist vision toward the care of animals. I'm sorry. It says broadening the Anabaptist vision toward the care of animals, and it's called the gospel of peace to all creation. Featured in the Mennonite, February 1st, 2012. But it says, when I meet new people and tell them that I am from New York, most assume that I grew up alongside of the millions of people in the city itself. I quickly correct this assumption by clarifying that I am from northern New York in a city called Watertown, about 300 miles north of the most populous city in the United States. Northern New York is largely covered in forests, small lakes, and the Adirondack mountain range, a far cry from a city that is home to over 8 million people. It seems clear to me now that it was this geographical context with its low human population and rich natural expanses that allowed me to develop a strong bond to creation from an early age. So this gentleman, he was raised in upstate New York rather than New York City. Though not raised a Mennonite, this love of creation will greatly affect my life years later when the Anabaptist vision of peace awakens in my heart. As a child, I lived outside the city of Watertown with easy access to thickly forested areas and abundant wildlife. I love being in the woods. It's quiet, no one can bother me, and it's home to many animals, all of whom captivate my imagination. I spend hours in the woods listening to birds, watching fish in small ponds, and delighting in the squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, and deer that populate our backyard. I also live in a house that is always home to companion animals. Cats are the pet of choice at home, but there are also dogs, rabbits, assorted rodents, birds, turtles, fish, and even snakes. Animals are my perpetual companions throughout childhood. They are part of my family and deserve compassion and respect as much as humans. At no point are animals outside my moral sphere. The compassion and respect that I learned as a child are never relegated to the human world only. Fast forward from my childhood to seminary life, I began coursework at Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana, and adopted my first two cats, Julio and Fargo. For 3 years, I read and wrote theology with these two always in my presence. Though academic life is not exactly exciting, Julio and Fargo seem to enjoy it, as they rarely leave my side. During this time, I came to know my new friends thoroughly and learned that they share many human characteristics with me. I see joy and excitement when Julio begs to be led outside and explore the backyard and bathe in the sun. I see contentment and a love of companionship as Fargo sleeps away the days, as close to me as he can get. I see frustration when the two want to sit in the same spot, anger when one tries to take a large share of the food, fear in the face of new situations, and the discontent of physical pain. Like me, they know joy and sorrow and want a life of peace in which they can flourish. Day after day, as I study nonviolence along these two friends, it is hard not to wonder if the Anabaptist vision should include them. As these friendships grow and my commitment to pacifism becomes stronger, the Anabaptist vision begins to stir beyond its original intent. I consider whether the nonviolence that so strongly defines my tradition ought to include Julio, Fargo, and others like them. The Christian tradition is filled with resources that encourage humans to extend dignity and nonviolence to animals and the entire creation. I discover that from the creation narrative, which is Genesis 1-2, to Isaiah's peaceable kingdom, to the teachings of Jesus, we are repeatedly encouraged to treat all creation with the love of Christ. What I find most powerful, however, is Paul's eschatological vision of salvation in Romans 8:18-23, and that's probably one of my favorites as well. Definitely my top 5 favorite verses is Romans 8 by Paul. Paul convinces me that God desires to redeem the entire cosmos, not simply humanity. I learned from him to envision an end to creation's bondage to decay, and to hope that God will somehow end the suffering and violence that now permeates existence. I come to believe with Paul that God has a better eschatological end in mind for the entire cosmos, an end free of the pain and suffering of violence. This is admittedly a big vision. Every day I experience and benefit from the violence built into the natural process of the cosmos. Yet, though violence in nature is inevitable, I am not convinced we must therefore accept any and every instance of it as though nothing can be done or as if God is simply waiting for the eschaton, also known as the last things, to redeem creation. As I read and reflect on Anabaptist nonviolence in the Christian eschatological tradition, I see the beauty of a divine vision not meant for the future alone. The Anabaptist tradition has long resisted the idea that the teachings of Jesus are restricted to some future time when they will be completely possible, from future time when they will be completely possible to live. We see the vision of Christ as one meant to transform our world here and now. Anabaptists have certainly not blindly accepted violence between humans as the way things have to be, despite the fact that violence has played a large role in human heritage. While a vision of ecological nonviolence cannot be completely ushered in at the moment, this does not mean we simply wait for a future time to extend the gospel of peace to our animal neighbors. I love what he says there, our animal neighbors. With the peaceful end God has in mind for creation, it is clear that Anabaptist Mennonite nonviolence has a direct role to play in our relationship with creation. I propose that we broaden the Anabaptist vision of nonviolence to a vision of eco-pacifism. Exactly what this means and how it should work out is complex and requires actual dialogue in Anabaptist communities. To put it simply, I suggest eco-pacifism as an ethic that, one, sees all creation as morally considerable, and two, employs the ideal of nonviolence to, three, treat all creation insofar as it is possible in accord with its intrinsic nature, allowing it to meet its own purposes and function according to its own design. I recall vividly my realization of the necessity of a theology of nonviolence towards our animal neighbors. While reading C. David Coates' Old MacDonald's Factory Farm, I was horrified to discover the methods of modern industrialized farming, a far cry from traditional animal husbandry. From a chapter on pigs and factory farms, I learned about the treatment of sows used to give birth to as many offspring as possible, all of whom will be slaughtered for human consumption. I read of mothers confined for the better part of their short lives to birthing crates where they can barely move, let alone properly care for their young. The thought of an animal being restricted from movement for 3 to 4 years, being forced to give birth as often as they are able, and then to be deprived from natural interaction with their young, moved me to tears. I found that conditions for other animals are no better. I immediately became a vegetarian and sought other ways to promote nonviolence toward our animal neighbors. How could I continue to accept such radical violence toward creatures loved by a God who seeks to redeem them from violence? Eco-pacifism does not always mean a refusal to take life. I recognize that we cannot always survive without some forms of violence and the taking of life. But we may ask, when is it in line with God's eschatological vision to refrain from killing if it is unnecessary for our survival? Let me read that again. But we may ask, when it is in line with God's eschatological vision to refrain from killing if it is unnecessary for our survival. Since so much of the future described above relates to an end to suffering, Anabaptists should consider refraining from killing or supporting the killing and torturing of other than human animals that have the capacity to suffer when it is not necessary for our survival. While we cannot eliminate all violence in nature, it does seem to be in our power to extend the nonviolent love of the gospel to many animals. Doing this represents a further inbreaking of the kingdom that we believe ought to impact our world now, as well as characterize the age to come. My experiences have shaped my sensitivity toward this topic. My upbringing in close proximity to animals of all kinds, my strong bonds with two specific companion animals, and my love for the Anabaptist tradition of nonviolence shapes my outlook on life. Humans are by the only species longing for redemption and peace. God offers this redemption and peace to all creation, not just humans. Redemption begins on earth and involves living according to the divine vision of peace here and now. And he's Isaiah 11 throughout this, by the way. Isaiah 11, 6 through 9 of the wolf will lay with the lamb and a little child will take care of them. To this end, Christians ought to begin extending the gospel of peace beyond the border of species. That we may never in this life arrive at the fullness of the vision, we can see its partial fulfillment as we live more and more peacefully with our animal neighbors. And I thought that was a really lovely statement by him. And I really like his idea of eco-pacifism. It's this idea that animals are worthy of moral consideration, and when we can refrain from killing them for, that we don't need to kill them out of survival, why kill them? And I really like that approach of nonviolence. And That was by Matthew Eaton. He's a doctoral candidate at the University of St. Michael's College and the University of Toronto, studying theology with a focus on ecological and animal ethics, and he attends Toronto United Mennonite Church. So I think that article was actually from about over 10 years ago. So that probably actually is, he's probably graduated and everything by now. So, but I really liked his statement there, and I thought that that was really great. His reference of Romans 8 and Isaiah 11 is perfectly done, and he references how um, it's a very Christian behavior to try to bring peace to all of creation, and that should really be a goal of every Christian, is to make the world more peaceful and amiable for our animal neighbors, as he most perfectly put it. But that's the end of the teaching. I really thank everybody for attending today, and like I said, I have a great respect for the Anabaptists after reading about them and seeing that they too have a focus on nonviolence, and even though it's not perfect, they have room for improvement, and I have hope that they can extend this to animals in the future. But I'll close out prayer. If anybody has any questions, feel free to state them while I do that. But Heavenly Father, thank you so much for allowing me to teach your word and to focus on uh, that honors your high ideals of nonviolence and peace, and help us to bring that to a reality that you describe in Isaiah 11, where the wolf will lay with the lamb and a little child will lead them, and there will be no harm or violence on all of your holy mountain. And I pray this in Jesus' name, amen. And so thank you all for attending. And next, let me think, it's going to be 2 weeks. So it'll be the 25th, I believe. Or no, is it? I think it's the 23rd, actually. I think it's my wife's birthday. Um, November 23rd is my next teaching. And that is on Pentecostalism. And so we'll go over that. That'll be a good teaching as well. But I look forward to seeing you. Have a great week, and we'll stay in touch. We have a lot of alerts coming out also from our ministry, Christian Association, about future actions you can take for the animals. And so I look forward to sharing those with you as well. But have a great week, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.